Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the College Sports Superfan. And we've got some great games to get into for this college football week 10. Lots of great matchups that are under the radar. And of course, the big game in Pennsylvania between the number 4 Ohio State Buckeyes and the number 3 Penn State Nittany Lions. I'll have a separate video coming out about that game. But in the meantime, we'll talk about some other under the radar games. I've got 9 of them to talk about, just some quick thoughts about and kind of who I think is going to win these games. Let's start with Ole Miss at Arkansas. Number 19 Ole Miss, they're 6-2 on the year at Arkansas, who's 5-3. Sam Pittman is kind of on the hot seat at Arkansas, really needs to pull off another big win and have a decent season in order to keep his job. This is the perfect opportunity to do that. Ole Miss started out really, really well. Of course, we all saw them lose to the Kentucky in that shocker. Kind of been sliding downhill as the season has gone on, but they've still got a red hot offense that's averaging 354 passing yards per game, led by Jackson Dart. Also, with the elite defense only allowing 11 points per game. But this Arkansas defense has been battle tested. They've had some big moments where, of course, they've upset Tennessee at home, but against LSU at home, they really didn't look all that great with a similar potent passing attack. Ole Miss is favored by 7. I think this could be a close one, but I'm personally probably going to say the Rebels do survive this trap and win this game against their rival, Arkansas. And then the Razorbacks athletic department are going to have a decision to make. All right, let's talk about Minnesota at Illinois. Number 24 Illinois returns home after they had a beatdown against the number 1 team in the country, Oregon. I think this Illinois team is still really, really, really good. You can't fault them too much for losing to the number 1 team in the country. But as they return home, they're 6-2. They're hosting Minnesota, who's 5-3. The Golden Gophers having themselves a very solid season. They just dominated Maryland. They've won 3 straight games. First, they upset USC at home, who at the time was number 11. Then they went on the road and won a surprisingly close game against UCLA, but then they just flat out dominated the Maryland Terrapins, which was supposed to be a close game. Now, Minnesota is a 3-point favorite on the road against number 24 Illinois. Me personally, I don't really see that, although I think this game could be very close. To me, the Illini still have the much better offense just across the board than Minnesota has, even though Rosemer has added in a spark at quarterback. I think Illinois ultimately still wins this game. I'm going to say the Illini win this game by 7 at home. All right, moving on to the next game. We're going to go back to the SEC here. Vanderbilt at Auburn. The Auburn Tigers came really close to beating Missouri. That was a huge moment for this team and trying to turn things around. They went on the road against Kentucky, which was supposed to be a very close, very even game, and Auburn won that game 24-10. If you're the Vanderbilt Commodores, you're looking at this one, even though it's on the road, you really need to win this game to go bowling. They're 5-3, still a very difficult schedule for the Commodores coming up. As for Auburn, of course, their schedule still pretty tricky. They host UL Monroe after this game. So theoretically, let's say they beat Vanderbilt, they beat UL Monroe. That gets them to 5-5. But then they would still have to split their final 2 games, which would be at home against number 10 Texas A&M and on the road against their arch rival number 14 Alabama in the Iron Bowl. So that's going to be very tricky to accomplish both of those things. Vanderbilt, I think they're legit. I think they're really, really good. This Auburn team has a great defense. They're favored by 7, but I'm going to go gutsy and say that Vanderbilt wins this game by 3, gets to the postseason, and Auburn season officially ends, and they'll have question marks when it comes to keeping around Hugh Freeze. All right, moving on to the next game, Arizona State against Oklahoma State. This is a really interesting game. The Big 12 has been just a crazy, wild conference this season. Arizona State started out really, really, really strong when they're picked to finish towards the bottom. Sorry. Arizona State started out really, really, really strong, and they were picked to finish towards the bottom of this Big 12 conference. ASU right now is a 3-point favorite on the road against Oklahoma State, who's 3-5. And before the season started, the Cowboys were expected to be one of the best teams in the Big 12, but things have really gone off the rails there. Arizona State is 5-2. Oklahoma State is 3-5. If you look at ASU's schedule after this, again, a home game against UCF. They get on the road against number 17 Kansas State. They host number 9 BYU, which could be an interesting trap game for the Cougars there. And then they're on the road in the Territorial Cup against their arch rival Arizona, who's a pretty solid team in their own right. So for Arizona State, there really is no true give me games. Technically, UCF is the easiest game on their schedule, and that's the one after this. I'm going to say Oklahoma State causes more Big 12 chaos, and they end up defeating Arizona State. And the reason why is because I feel like the Cowboys have started to make some progress. They lost a close one to BYU. They lost by 10 on the road against Baylor, but you can see some progress starting to come around. I don't think the losing streak is going to continue for too much longer. They're currently on a 5-game losing streak after they started the year 3-0. I think Oklahoma State breaks that losing streak, ends up winning by 3 at home over Arizona State. All right, let's move on to number 10, Texas A&M at South Carolina. This one is probably one of the least under the radar games out of these options because it is the main SEC on ABC game at night. But still, a lot of people might be overlooking this one. The Aggies are currently first place in the SEC. They're the last undefeated team in the SEC. They're favored by 2.5 points. It's a nighttime game against South Carolina. But you know what? This season has been filled with chaos. I bet against the Aggies a lot of times this season, and it's been, it's proved me wrong. But they had a very impressive win against LSU. This South Carolina team, though, is very sneaky. They're 4-3. They've had definitely one of the most interesting seasons of the year. They barely lost to LSU. They barely lost to Alabama on the road. They dominated Oklahoma last week. Absolutely dominated. They could have won that game by a lot more. I actually think South Carolina is going to pull off this upset. Give me the Gamecocks to win this game by 3 and stop the last undefeated in conference play SEC team and open up the door to all sorts of weird chaos in the final weeks. That's what I'm expecting to happen. All right, here's a solid classic Big Ten matchup: Wisconsin at Iowa. Wisconsin and Iowa, classic rivalry. They've been playing for a long, long time, practically, I think, since the late 1800s. Both teams are 5-3. Iowa is only a 3-point favorite at home. The Hawkeyes have had a much better offense. Listen to this: 29 points per game. Their total yards are they've had over 200 yards rushing, 209 yards rushing to be exact. That running back that they've got there on their team is just so good. I mean, Caleb Johnson has just been a superstar. I was pulling up his numbers right now: 1,144 yards, 7.8 yards per carry, and 16 touchdowns. Undoubtedly, Caleb Johnson, one of the most under the radar players in the country, one of the best running backs in the country. As a result, I think Iowa does win this game. I'm going to say they win this game by 7 over Wisconsin, even though the Badgers have gotten better as the season has gone on. I think the Hawkeyes will clinch bowl eligibility in this one. Okay, here's a really fun matchup here: USC at Washington. This is also a nighttime game. Both of these teams are 4-4. The Huskies, no, sorry, the Trojans are 2.5 point favorites on the road against the Huskies. I agree with that. I think it's a very even game. USC does have a little bit more talent. They're also feeling the pressure, especially with head coach Lincoln Riley is feeling the pressure with his job for what feels like is on the line here, as USC had really high hopes heading into the season. Then they won that game against LSU in Las Vegas, and that really shot the hopes up through the roof. A lot of people thought, hey, they could make the college football playoff. And then even after they lost a close game against Michigan, people were still saying, hey, this team is really, really, really good. They could still make the college football playoff. Well, now that's completely out of the window. They've got four losses. They're not making it to the playoff. Now the question is, can they make it to a bowl game? However, I actually think Washington is going to win this game by three because if you're the Huskies and you're looking at your schedule, after you play USC, you've got Penn State on the road. They're not going to win that. They got UCLA at home in their home finale, and then they got to go on the road against number one Oregon. They're not going to win that game either. So that's two losses, and you need two wins to go bowling. So they are going to have to beat the Los Angeles teams in order to get there. My prediction is that Washington is going to beat both of them, and the Huskies are going to finish the year 6-6, just barely going bowling in Jed Fish's first season. Whereas USC, I think they dropped this game against Washington. Then they might bounce back against Nebraska. That's a close one. Then they'll play UCLA. That'll also be a very close one. And then they host Notre Dame. Where I think there is some upset potential there, but I'd probably ride with the Irish to win that one. Overall, I'm going to say USC probably beats Nebraska and UCLA, both very close. And the Trojans also finish the year 6-6 and go to a bowl game. But that's definitely not what people had in mind with USC to begin the season. All right, let's move on now. What else we got? I think I've only got a couple more. Yeah, I've got TCU at Baylor, so we just got a couple more games here. The Horned Frogs and the Baylor Bears. This is a fantastic rivalry. Both these schools have had some serious classics against each other, some really high scoring games against each other. TCU is 5-3, Baylor is 4-4. As I just mentioned, the Baylor Bears are getting a little bit better as the season goes on. So Baylor's had an interesting year. They lost in overtime on the road to Colorado. They lost by just 6 points to number 22 BYU. They got dominated by Iowa State 43-21, but again, the Cyclones could be the best team in the Big 12. So it's hard to judge Baylor's season based on losing those quality opponents. They went on the road. They dominated Texas Tech 59-35. They beat Oklahoma State 38-28. Now they got TCU at home. They're 3-point favorites. I haven't been too terribly impressed with the Horned Frogs and the direction the team is heading in. So I actually agree with that completely. I'm going to say Baylor wins this game by three. I 100% agree with the spread on this one. The over-under also 64.5. So they are thinking that this is going to be a high scoring game as well. And if you look at the total amount of yards, TCU 435.5 yards per game, Baylor 409 yards per game. So there's going to be, and then the points, TCU 32.5 points per game, Baylor 33 points per game. It's going to be a ton of yards, going to be a ton of points put up on the board. This is going to be one of the most fun games of the weekend. I think Baylor's going to win an instant classic, win this game by three, and get to 5-4. TCU is going to drop to 5-4. After that, Baylor has West Virginia, Houston, and Kansas, which are all toss-up games, in my opinion, on the road against West Virginia and Houston, and then at home against Kansas. Who knows how those games are going to go? Those are all complete toss-ups. So Baylor could easily finish, 5-7, or they could end up, winning out the rest of their games and going 8-4. Kind of hard to know. It could go either way, really. TCU, let's say they lose to Baylor, that'll put them at 5-4. Then they host Oklahoma State. Then they host Arizona. Then they go on the road against Cincinnati. Again, same thing. I probably wouldn't pick them to beat Cincinnati. That's probably a loss. But those other two games, total toss-ups, could go either way. So TCU, again, same story. They could end up with 6 or 7 wins, or they could end up losing out. Just hard to know. So, last game here, number 18 Pittsburgh at number 20 SMU. This is the second biggest game of the weekend, no doubt about it. Matters hugely in the ACC standings. After that big game in State College between the Buckeyes and the Nittany Lions, this is the next big game to pay attention to. It's 8 o'clock on ACC Network. The Pitt Panthers are 7-0, and they're ranked number 18 in the country. They've just had a super dominant season. Although at times they've had some close games against Cal. They only won by 2 points. Against North Carolina, they won by 10. West Virginia, they won by 4. Cincinnati on the road, they won by 1. But they are coming off of a very, very dominant game against Syracuse where they dominated the turnovers. Again, Kyle McCord was throwing interceptions like crazy, and Syracuse committed 5 turnovers in that loss to Pitt. So that is something to keep in mind with that dominant win. SMU, they've had a super high flying offense. They've been definitely picking up the yardage. And both these teams, their numbers are so similar across the board. Points per game, Pittsburgh, 41 points per game, SMU, 39 points per game. Yards, Pitt, 443, SMU, 443 and a half. So literally basically even there. Points allowed, Pittsburgh, 22, SMU, 21 and a half. So basically the same there. Yardage allowed, Pitt has been allowing more yards. SMU, yeah, so Pitt has been allowing 350 yards per game, SMU 327 yards per game. SMU 7-1 on the year at home. They are 7.5 point favorites. And their only loss is a 3 point loss at home to BYU, which at the time, people were just like, oh, okay, whatever. They're both probably mediocre. But now that loss to the BYU Cougars looks so much better after we've seen how good BYU is. They went on the road. They had an amazing game against Duke. Last week, they won that game 28-27 in overtime. That was an absolute classic to stay undefeated in conference play. So both these teams in the driver's seat to potentially get to the ACC championship game. Right now, it's kind of a 4 team race between Miami, Clemson, and these two. And the unfortunate thing is SMU, Miami, and Clemson are all not going to play each other this season. So you may end up with a three-way tie at the end of the season. That's just the downside of these super conferences that people didn't realize. One thing's for certain is that this will be a conference title and likely college football playoff eliminator game. And I'm going to say SMU at home is going to end up winning this game by 3. I don't think they win it by 7, but I think they win this game by 3 and eliminate Pittsburgh from the ACC title. And then SMU is just going to have to win out and hope that they get the tiebreaker rules because if they win out, they will be undefeated in ACC conference play. But there's also the possibility that Miami and Clemson both also end up undefeated in conference play. So that'll be some interesting tiebreakers there. All right, those are 9 under the radar games to watch in week 10. Those ones are all going to be super, super good. I said my predictions for those games. And then I've got a game coming out about the really huge game in State College, Pennsylvania, between the number 4 Ohio State Buckeyes and the number 3 Penn State Nittany Lions. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching the College Sports Superfan.